Hello and welcome to Cover Story. Today we're taking a look at the world of Donald Trump, how to exist in such a situation. We've seen what happened in the Oval Office, we are seeing what is happening with the Ukraine, and of course we're seeing how he's quickly and very methodically dismantling the post-Cold War security arrangements, the global free trade system. We are living in a world where multilateralism, US as a superpower no longer exists. It is really every nation for itself. It's a bilateral world, and how does India negotiate this? Joining me on this discussion is, I have with me Pavan Varma. He's a former ambassador, former Rajya Sabha MP, and he's also an author and a commentator. And Manish Tewari, former cabinet union minister of broadcasting. He's a Lok Sabha member and someone who's both actually are geostrategic experts. Manish, I'll begin with you. And of course, I want to tell our viewers, since we don't have a BJP person, let's keep this bipartisan and just look at, what we also want of national interest and how is India going to negotiate? So how do you see us?
Well, Priya, first and foremost, I think it would be a mistake to say that the United States still doesn't remain the biggest hyperpower in the world. In terms of simply its defense expenditure, it is 5 times more than its nearest competitor, China. So it's the single biggest outside balancer in every region of the world. And that's where the tragedy really begins. Because President Donald Trump is taking America very rapidly from exceptionalism to transactionalism. Nice. And therefore, this rapid shift from a value-based architecture which the US had constructed post the Second World War, and which has held the field for over 7 decades, and the fact that there seems to be a very rapid descent into transactionalism without even a pushback from within the US system, unlike when President Trump was in office for the first time, that is extremely alarming. So therefore, President Trump has literally declared war on the whole world. So he's backed self-determination in Greenland. He wants the Panama Canal back. He's imposed tariffs on Mexico and China to pause them for Mexico and Venezuela and Canada to pause them for a bit. He's imposed tariffs on China. The Chinese embassy in the US has put out a very, very ominous tweet saying that if President Trump wants war, we are ready for a trade war and every other kind of war. So therefore, things are really in a churn. And the fact that he chose to name India as one of the biggest tariff abusers, in his State of the Union address, not once, but I think thrice over, is something that should worry us. So therefore, what you are seeing is the destruction of the old. It's like living in the age of the monsters, while the old is dying and the new is yet to be born. And that's where we are.
Age of monsters, which is true. He's also dismantling the world as we know it. He may abandon Europe, NATO. So how do we negotiate such a world?
No, I don't fundamentally disagree with Manish, but I felt that the value system for which America was known for decades, if not centuries, was itself transactional in many ways and riddled with contradictions. It was a unilateralism where in the garb of liberalism or protecting liberal democracy and Western values, a great deal was done that was, in my view, not only unethical but unwarranted. For instance, America's entry into Iraq and the havoc it caused there. The combined American and NATO bombing of Serbia, Libya, the entry into Afghanistan, the withdrawal, the transactional nature with regimes which were dictatorial in Latin America, the continued support of South Africa even during the apartheid regime. All of these were a betrayal of the very values they stood for. In a sense, and I'm no spokesperson for Donald Trump, in a sense, President Trump is removing that veil of respectability given to the smug sense of the Western ecosystem that they are right by being an insider within that. Now, for instance, the war with Ukraine, as an example. I mean, everyone knows, at least I believe, that that war, while of course it was an aggression against a sovereign nation, was in many ways provoked by unrestrained expansion of NATO, to which they had given promises to the contrary. And it reached a point where it became blatant in Ukraine. A regime was toppled, which was pro-Russian, with the machinations of the Western world. And the assumption was that Russia will do nothing. Now, for 3 years, we are having a war where literally thousands upon thousands have died. Billions of property has been destroyed. Western Europe is suffering because of the lack of supply of oil and gas from Russia. America is pumping in $350 billion as quoted by Donald Trump in terms of munitions. And frankly, it's an unwinnable war for Ukraine because the Western world has agreed to fight in Ukraine till the last Ukrainian without putting their feet on the ground. So the war has to end. So I think what Trump has done is to go over the head of the so-called bastions of Western liberal
Leaders.
ecosystem, I'll say, I'll not call it democracy, directly to the
Stakeholders.
protagonist, which is Putin, and try and find a deal which helps America, not necessarily the West, and which puts an end to this war in a manner where it gains certain benefits from Ukraine itself. Now, it could be called transaction, but it's also exposing the hypocrisy of the West. They were backing Ukraine largely on the basis of US defense supplies
Right.
and fighting a war where, imagine, for instance, if Russia had taken France, which in size would be geographically the same as about Ukraine, so close to what is the Western Europe NATO system. Would the West keep quiet? Ukraine is the underbelly of the Russia. And so, therefore, there are reasons why Trump probably is acting in a manner that seems disruptive but also exposes the hypocrisy.
Okay.
Now, having said this, where I agree with Manish is that he is mercurial, his policies are impulsive, his long-term plans are not properly thought out. For instance, the manner in which he interacted with Zelensky in front of the media, humiliating him, was entirely unwarranted and could have been done through back channels. So he loves the drama
Showmanship.
of the, but at this moment, it's too early to pass a judgment as if the old order is crumbling. The old order is under threat. And a new troika appears to be emerging from my point of view, which is the US, Russia, and China. And that is what should worry us.
Okay, old order is crumbling, but Pavan perhaps says that maybe it's not such a bad idea also, that, if there is a new, the hypocrisy of the others who are not involved is being exposed.
See, the fact is that every country, to a certain extent, when it comes to its national interests, is transactional in nature. So therefore, that is not something which is very unique to the United States of America alone. But the fact is that there is an international order which was crafted or which started getting incubated with the entry of the United States of America into the First World War, going back to 1970. And then when the Peace of Versailles, which was led by President Woodrow Wilson, unfortunately did not fructify, and then the League of Nations collapsed, you had the rise of Nazism and fascism on the European continent. And of course, 2 decades earlier, there had been the rise of communism with the establishment of the first communist state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So under these circumstances, when the US entered into the Second World War, as a consequence of an attack by another militaristic, imperialistic, totalitarian power, Japan, and the US and its allies won the war, the world order that got crafted post the Second World War was essentially a US-led world order, which at its substratum was based upon or premised upon certain values which stood in contradistinction to what was being espoused by the Soviet Union or what was colloquially called the Eastern Bloc. So it is not as if you had a system which did not have an ideological underpinning to it. There was a definitive ideological underpinning with the aberrations, as Pavanji rightly pointed out. So there was Vietnam, there were interventions in South and Latin America, there were interventions in Asia, the toppling of a government in Iran when the Shah was brought in, and so therefore you can really go on chapter and verse. But the fact is that the West, led by the United States of America, had given certain guarantees to Ukraine when they defanged them and made them give up their nuclear weapons. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994. And the security guarantees were given by the United States, by the United Kingdom, and by Russia. And therefore, to throw Ukraine under a bus. I mean, imagine a situation if Ukraine would have had nuclear weapons today. Would Russia have attacked it? The answer is no. Right. It's another debate whether those nuclear weapons were controlled by the Ukrainians or the control rested in Moscow. But even if they had a rudimentary nuclear device, it would have been a huge deterrent on any Russian expansionist plan.
Manish, if I may come in, you see, this argument that if a country had a nuclear deterrent, would foreign policy be different, is a universal. I mean, today Pakistan, for instance, has a nuclear weapon system, however rudimentary or undeveloped, but it has one. It is a deterrent.
Yes.
South Africa was asked to give up its nuclear capabilities, and it go. The point that I'm trying to make is that Ukraine did not have that nuclear shield, and the NATO was pushing. See, I just want to say one. May I just complete one line and then you come. You see, the NATO is not Gymkhana Club. It is not a forum for nice celebratory social gatherings. It is a defense organization.
Right.
And therefore, NATO, when counterpoised to against Russia, always has the tension of an expansionism which at some point will be checked by those powers which are not part of NATO. Now, Ukraine in particular, when Manish is throwing it under the bus, the West actively encouraged Ukraine to put itself in a position where it was likely to be hit by a bus. Because that was pushing the line.
I would disagree with that, Pavanji, with due respect. The fact is that the Russians, going back to the Soviet era, have never ever respected the sovereignty of Ukraine. Right? The only person who actually respected the sovereignty of Ukraine was Khrushchev, because he was himself a Ukrainian.
But that was the time of the USSR.
So that was in the time of the USSR. And it was Khrushchev who allowed Crimea to be a part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And therefore, if you extrapolate it from then on to when Ukraine declares independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fact is that it emerges as a sovereign nation. And so therefore, its sovereignty, when it was compelled or coerced or asked to give up its nuclear weapons, Its sovereignty and territorial integrity was guaranteed by the US, by the United Kingdom, and ironically by Russia. And so, therefore, under those circumstances, when the Russians decided to invade, first take Crimea in 2014, then take Donetsk, and then take Luhansk, and then in 22 decided to go further. I think it was incumbent upon the other two security guarantors to really stop them. And now what President Trump has done is a complete backflip. So he has reversed years and years of US policy. I mean, imagine a situation that in a blink of an eyelid, you have the United States voting with North Korea, Iran, and Russia, the first two having been characterized as the famous axis of evil by President George Bush 43. And Zelensky, who till 15 days ago, or Ukraine, who till a month ago, were being supplied with weapons, right, armed by the United States of America in order to protect their territorial integrity and sovereignty, is suddenly thrown under a bus. I think so. Therefore, while I understand Russian anxieties with regard to the eastward expansion of NATO, but that anxiety does not mean that you can gobble up a sovereign country and claim that there was nothing called Ukraine. It was always southern Russia, and Ukraine is an aberration.
Okay, Pavan, I know you to come in. Just a quick break, then we'll keep the conversation going. But stay with us. Hello and welcome back to a cover story conversation. We are trying to make sense of the world of Donald Trump. And Pavan, you wanted to come in on the point of the Ukraine.
First of all, I do not for a moment condone the invasion by Russia of Ukraine, because we live in an international order where the sovereignty and territorial integrity of nations are considered sacrosanct. Having said that, I am afraid instead of a absolute black and white polarity in terms of right and wrong, I take a grayer position where I say that yes, that is the norm. It has been flouted with impunity by those who today cry themselves hoarse, protecting sovereignty and territorial integrity, when they have invaded countries without any thought or of its rectitude or any international sanction backing it. Now, if Russia does it, there is moral outrage. And my point is this: I do not believe any invasion is right. But America itself going into Iraq, for instance, I say the sovereign and territorial integrity, on the suspicion that they have nuclear weapons, which was never proved.
Right.
And 60,000 people die in that. Now, my point is that this new international order, which I respect also, has been breached, in fact, if you ask me, in the post-Cold War era, far more by a dominant, unilateral, militarily stronger ecosystem of the West than by anybody else. Now with probably competition with China. Therefore, what Russia did in Ukraine as an invasion, I don't justify, but I take the larger issues in the background to say that a war that has been senselessly going on for 3 years is something that needed to end, and it would probably not end by persuading Zelensky, but by reaching a deal where Zelensky becomes compared to accept certain terms. And also, one last thing. There are also two sides to the narrative. One is what Manish put, and the other is what the Russians were telling the Ukrainians as a sovereign country for very long, that there are large parts bordering Russia in the Ukraine which consist overwhelmingly of Russian-speaking populations in the Donetsk area, and that treatment that was being meted out to them because of their proximity to Russia, was inhuman, and that therefore any attempt to have interventions of the West in an area and scenario which has security implications for Russia, humanitarian.
That's such convenient argument for justification, no? That,
May I come in for a moment?
Let Manish.
You see, that this is the most axiomatic argument. That my sovereign territory is invaded. And let me rewind further back. When Ukraine decided to become independent from Russia, it was an overwhelming vote of 99% plus in the Ukrainian parliament at that point in time, or whatever was the representative chamber of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. At that point in time, there was no protest from Russia, because Russia was a weakened power at that point in time. Now, 30 years later, 35 years later, because you've got some of that strength back, and you want to be a revisionist power again, which is that you want to recreate the erstwhile Soviet Union, or you want to recreate the erstwhile Russian Empire. And if somebody was to tell me that, look, your view does not matter, your territory, if it's been gobbled up by somebody, does not matter, you will agree to a peace deal, which I will do on your behalf, which would involve that you cede your territory to somebody who is an aggressor. What norms of international behavior are we setting? What are the standards we are setting? And to come back to what Pavan was saying earlier, he talked about the triple entente, US, Russia, China. Now, if let us suppose the same rigorous conditions were applied to some other part or some other geography in the world, which is the United States tells Taiwan that please accept the fact that you're a part of China and let the Chinese take you over. Is that acceptable? Or let's say the United States tomorrow tells India that, well, China's taken some part of your territory, they are sitting on that territory, and so therefore that is the status quo and you accept it. If we are ready for that kind of an international order, then God help us.
But is that what the US is saying, or it's saying, I won't help you defend?
It is slightly misconstrued. The fact that Russia accepted Ukrainian sovereignty is in fact attributable to Russia because the Soviet Union is split into independent republics. Has Russia threatened any of the other 12 or 13 republics that were formed from the erstwhile Soviet Union? It has not.
Not as yet. Well, you had Georgia. You had the transgression into Georgia in 2007-8. That was also a part of the erstwhile Soviet Union. You've had a...
Allow me to finish.
Okay.
It is an allegation that any large power in a neighboring scenario where there are smaller countries faces of intervention, which is seen as illegitimate and undemocratic by the smaller powers. Nepal complains against India, Sri Lanka complains against India, Maldives complains against India, whether it's true or not. So I'm not...
That's not a military intervention.
Just a minute. But I'm not saying that it is necessarily what the Russia has been doing with the other republics which have become independent.
But what about...
There could be the instances of Georgia, etc. But by and large, we've seen now since the Cold War, the Berlin Wall was demolished, that it has dealt with them as sovereign countries. The problem was with Ukraine, where it was in my view, it was the Western powers who reneged on a promise made to Russia about possible boundaries of NATO in its eastward expansion.
But Ukraine is not a part of Russia. It is not a part of NATO. In fact, NATO refused to give membership to Ukraine. But in fact, what this Russian aggression of Ukraine has done is that it has compelled a country like Finland, which was neutral from 1945 onwards. You had the famous phrase of Finlandization, right? Because Finland had the unique distinction of fighting on both sides of the Second World War. Right? Coming and joining NATO. You had Sweden, which was again neutral for the entire post-Cold War period, which decided that it had to join NATO for its security. So therefore, rather than stopping NATO, what the Russian aggression of Ukraine has done is that it has impelled other European powers, which were keeping out of NATO, to come under the security and protective umbrella of NATO.
I don't think there are many powers left now because they've taken the Baltic states, they've taken Eastern Europe into the NATO framework. Ukraine was a test case. And I think Russia had conveyed very strongly that any attempts to interfere in the internal politics of Ukraine, and the record is very clear that that actually happened.
The Russians did that too. The Russians did that too.
Yes, sir.
So therefore, it wasn't as if the shoe was on one foot. The shoe was on both the feet. The Russians interfered first, and the West interfered later. If you say the Maidan Revolution, etc., was instigated, sponsored by the by the West. Yes.
So Russia's doing so in Ukraine is not necessarily condonable, but it's a neighboring country which is the underbelly of the former Soviet Union and the current Russian nation. But for the entire and collective might of NATO to continue to push beyond certain boundaries that they had said it would not cross, and actually try to play that in Ukraine, partially led to what was certainly ethically and according to international norms wrong, which was the invasion. But there are such war has been fought for 3 years. And in this, the question comes, how should India now see its future with the US? But I don't know if we have the time.
No, we don't have the time. That later. And the question of what happens in Taiwan now, is the Ukraine impact will fall. I wanted to go into that also, but I think we are out of time.
No, well, in the sense, just to say one line, you see, the precedent which Ukraine is setting, or the US behavior towards Ukraine is setting, is very, very potentious. And India needs to be extremely careful, and other Asia-Pacific nations need to be extremely careful.
Every country to see that America is, in the long run, a reliable protector against any interests that go against its own interests. Itself is a wrong
At that point in time. At that point in time.
A wrong assumption, and it is proven many times. However, I will conclude for lack of time by saying that the Russian-Ukraine war needs to stop. And the West would have been happy.
But needs to stop on honorable terms.
I would need to continue, would have allowed it to continue till the last Ukrainian on the basis of American weapons. And somewhere Donald Trump has pulled the rug under the feet of both the Western European powers and of the assumptions of Ukraine, and is dealing directly now in what is the real danger, or perhaps a new form of Russia
dealing with the sovereignty of another nation over the head of that nation, with a nation which is an aggressor, is the new international order that which we are going to.
You began by saying it's a very transactional order world that we are going to be living in. Is it good or bad? You figure out. We've laid it out on the table, and there's much more discussions to be had. I'm going to call both of you back again, but for now, it's a wrap. Thank you.